All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Zoe Carpenter. Zoe is a reporter for The Nation magazine, which you can, of course, find at thenation.com. You can also follow her on Twitter at Zoe S. Carpenter. Zoe, thank you for being on the show again.
Sure, thanks for having me.
All right, so Zoe, you recently wrote an article for The Nation magazine on how we should be wary of politicians who are phony populists, who are inequality opportunists. Tell us what you mean exactly.
Well, I think it's pretty remarkable that pretty much everyone who calls themselves a Democrat has acknowledged that economic inequality is a huge problem and that we should do something about it. So there seems to be consensus around the issue. However, if you look below the surface to the types of proposals that are being put forth on how to tackle economic inequality, there's a real gap between people who want to challenge a lot of the corporate interests and change the structure of the economy and the way that it funnels wealth to the top, versus other people who think that we can basically solve the problem by maintaining the structure of the economy and just freeing up the market. So it's sort of a modified trickle-down.
Exactly. So who are some of the main proponents of the sort of modified trickle-down type of thing, this thing that doesn't really want to shake the way it's going now? Who are some of the main people at the top of that list?
So someone like Larry Summers, you know, he has come out and said that inequality is something that should be at the front of our list to tackle. And then, you know, he talks about celebrating the job creators and things like that. Then we also have the tech sector. So their answer is to provide more help for startups and for tech companies, so sort of special treatment and deregulation to free up that sector. So it's all about empowering the business class.
You actually wrote that President Obama has actually shifted the way he talks about this. He did talk about inequality, and now he's actually changing his language, talking more about opportunity. Talk about the president and how what his proposals might actually do.
Yeah, so we have seen that shift in language from the president. You know, he gave a big inequality speech in December where he really talked about inequality, and he laid out a pretty strong history for how we got here. So the specific policy decisions, the deregulation, some of the trade things that got us to this position. And since then we've seen a shift. So now he's talking about opportunity, and when he tells the story about how we got to this huge gap between the rich and the poor, it's more a story about how these forces outside of our control, namely globalization and technological change, have thrust inequality upon us. So there's a big shift in how the narrative is being told, and in response, the kinds of policy solutions we're seeing are much more small bore. Some of them are great policies, like raising the minimum wage, but they're grossly inadequate to the scale of the challenges.
Yeah, and it's also, in my opinion, it's also really disingenuous to think that this is not by design, that it's just globalization. This has nothing to do with the fact that this has actually been rigged this way. And again, it's something, it's infuriating to kind of watch this. But so it's like we kind of have this double-edged sword where it's like it's good that the national conversation is about income inequality, which is one of the most gigantic problems we have in this country. But again, it's also election time, so you have these politicians trying to say something they think it's going to get them elected. But again, when you look at a good chunk of Obama's economic policies, they're pretty horrible. He hasn't really shaked up Wall Street at all. His Justice Department didn't prosecute anybody. And when you speak of globalization, we have Obama pushing the secret trade pact, the TPP, which is NAFTA on steroids. So it's like he really is talking out of both sides of his butt on some of these things.
I think that's right. And, I think we have to, when we talk about globalization and the way that it's affected us, or it's affected the U.S. economy, our policies have shaped the way that globalization manifests itself. So, trade agreements, like you just mentioned, are a good example of that. It doesn't have to work the way that we have made it work. These are deliberate choices being made. And I think that the main divide here that we're looking at is whether or not we have to challenge the power of the 1%. And I think for people like Obama and Larry Summers, they think that you can bring up the bottom and grow out the middle without actually troubling the people at the very top. Whereas, on the other hand, if you're someone like Elizabeth Warren and you're talking about the system being rigged, changing that necessarily means removing some of the political and economic power that the 1% has at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely differences of actually trying to do structural change, and it really is beholden to activists and voters to really pay attention to this and to not fall for people who are actually using this language. But then when you actually look at the actual proposals, again, maybe that probably don't have much of a chance of getting through anyway, but when even their bare proposals are just a minor tweak that really don't do anything to really change the structural inequality in the country.
Right, and they're great places to start. Things like the minimum wage, paid sick leave, early childhood college affordability, all those sort of fair shots, they're calling them, those proposals that are being pushed right now, and those are meant to draw the line against the Republicans in the midterms. Unfortunately, just because of the nature of the electoral map this year, Democrats are likely to suffer some big losses, especially in the Senate, and we could expect to see a backlash from the center of the Democratic Party regarding populism, sort of saying, hey, we tried populism, it didn't work. Let's go back to more of the corporate-friendly approach, when in fact populism isn't exactly getting a fair trial.
Yeah, that is again, and I know that's what's going to happen because that's what always happens. But again, it's not like they've actually really instituted any actual populist policies. It's not like that they've said a lot of populist things. They may have used some populist language, but actually doing economic populism has not happened under the Democrats and the Obama administration.
That's right. And part of that, I think we have to acknowledge, is because half of Congress is controlled by a party that doesn't want to do anything. So there are lots of factors in play here with the lack of movement, but I think it's fair to say that there is a sizable chunk of the Democratic Party that wants certain parts of the status quo to be preserved in terms of the way, in terms of who controls the economic and political system.
No, I mean, obviously, after the Republicans took over the House, there is a bit of, you really can't even get some minor things done because they block every single solitary thing. But again, like we've both been saying here, I think you can, if you want to look at the administration, you can look no further than the Justice Department to actually look at and how they actually handled the financial crash and how, again, very well documented that no Wall Street banker went to jail for that. If you look at that, you can pretty much, extrapolate from there what their opinion on actually shaking up the structure actually is. You can look at Dodd-Frank, where, again, over half of Dodd-Frank still isn't even in place, and pretty much everyone who looks at it looks at Dodd-Frank and say, you know what, Dodd-Frank didn't go nearly far enough to actually shake up what caused the crash to begin with here. Right,
and it's not just enforcement and repercussions for bad actors. Mm-hmm. It's also the rules that are being written now in the wake of the financial crisis. So, Mary Jo White at the SEC, part of her role is as an enforcer, but also in terms of writing the regulations. And so when we think about what should happen in the wake of all the bad action on Wall Street, it's not just cracking down on the criminal actors. It's also making a regulatory framework that's strong enough to prevent something like this from happening again.